sitting on the bed in his room in the juvenile detention center where he had just been transferred, accompanied by the warden. Future maniac Donald Gaskins thought to himself, "Why did I hit her with the axe? After all, I could have run. I'd be walking around my town now, looking for a little house to get something to eat." Suddenly a rough voice interrupted his musings. "Oh, what a juicy girl. Wouldn't you like to have some fun after lights out tonight?" Donald looked up to see a large teenager in the doorway, staring at him. "Yeah, fuck you," Donald told him, and went back to his own thoughts. That night the would-be maniac Donald Gaskins, who went to jail for the first time in his life and left a bad memory in the United States, was brutally used by a group of 20 people, just like him, juvenile scumbags. Perhaps no serial killer in the history of the 20th century was more disgusting than Donald Henry Gaskins, nicknamed Shirty. Hello, this is Defunct City. Subscribe to our channel and don't forget to click on the bell so you don't miss new episodes and stay informed. While on death row, this maniac confessed to the journalist who interviewed him more than 100 people he took his life. Most of his victims were women and children. He was twice sentenced to death, but both sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. Eventually the maniac was executed anyway, after a new conviction for the massacre of an inmate named Rudolph Tyner. Maniac Donald Henry Gaskins was born on March 13, 1933, in Florence, South Carolina. Who was his father? It remains a mystery to this day. His mother alone could not cope with raising her son, so she decided to get married. Donald did not recognize his stepfather, and when he turned 11, he dropped out of school. He got a job at an auto repair shop, and there he met two teenagers just as troubled as he was. After that, the three of them started stealing gasoline. Then the trio moved on to bigger thefts. The gang broke up after the three of them abused the sister of one of the gang members. The girl complained to her parents, and her angry father caught all three. He hung each of them from the ceiling in his garage and beat them for a long time. As a result of this preventive measure, two members of the criminal network fled town, while Donald continued to steal and steal. It all ended in an attempt on his life. After climbing into the house, Gaskins struck the landlady with an axe, who caught him in the act of stealing. The injured woman managed to survive. Subsequently, there was a trial and the offender received his first sentence. On his first night in the juvenile detention facility, the would-be maniac was used as a sexual playmate by other inmates. From that point on, in order to survive in the colony, he had to become the personal girlfriend of the leader of the inmates. But this did not save the guy from intimate assault by other inmates. Very often the ringleader gave him to his buddies for the night. Donald would make several escapes, get caught, and add to his sentence. After each one, he was manhandled and abused by other inmates. 18-year-old Gaskins was released from the colony in the year 1951. Within a year he was married. His wife soon gave birth to a daughter. But Gaskins did not turn out to be a model father of the family. The maniac went back to prison for 5 years for assault and striking an elderly woman in the head with a hammer. In addition, 1 year was added to his sentence for contempt of court. In prison, not to be used again, Gaskins took the life of a known gangster and gained prestige. He disposed of him with a knife. This happened in the year 1953. His crimes were nevertheless assessed as self-defense and added another 3 years to his sentence. In the year 1955, Gaskins escaped from prison by hiding in a garbage truck, for which he again received a bump to his sentence for the escape. The maniac was released on parole in the year 1961. But the criminal never took the path of reform. He continued to steal. In the year 1962, Gaskins forced a 12-year-old girl into a sexual act and was captured. The assembled locals wanted to hold a lynching trial, but police intervention prevented them from lynching the criminal, and Gaskins, taking advantage of the protection of the authorities, simply escaped with his new 17-year-old roommate. On their way to Florida, the police got on their trail. A pursuit ensued. As a result, the maniac was unable to cope with the controls. His car skidded into a swamp, but he managed to escape, leaving his new girlfriend behind. Having hitchhiked to his native city, Gaskins, as if nothing had happened, presented himself to his first wife, who accepted him. But his mother-in-law was not happy to see him back and secretly called the police. Gaskins was arrested and sent back to prison for 6 years, with an additional 2 years for running away. During the trial, the maniac deeply angered the jury and stated that he did not agree with the prosecution, believing that girls had the right to be sexually active from the age of 10. The maniac was released in the year 1968 and again on parole. He was released because the prisons were overcrowded in the late 60s. The maniac was released on the condition that he would not reside in his hometown for several years. So he moved to the town of Sumter, located in South Carolina. Here he took a job with a construction company. There began the first series of atrocities, which Gaskins later called the coastal attacks. It must be said that the maniac categorized the killings he committed into 2 types of complex cases, and for the sake of pleasure. To the first he referred to the massacre of people who were somehow related to him. To the second, the hunt for people who hitchhiked. The series of massacres began in the year 1969. After work, Gaskins drove his car on the roads of South Carolina in search of solitary hitchhikers. Attacks for the sake of pleasure were particularly brutal. Gaskins tortured people in a long and sophisticated way before he massacred them. Each time, the maniac tried to prolong their lives as long as possible in order to enjoy the torture. Many of his victims were teenagers. It was as if Gaskins was taking revenge for their difficult childhood. The maniac was saved from arrest by the fact that hitchhikers were not sought immediately, and searching for such people was difficult. When the police intensified patrols on the roads, apparently working out a series of attacks, Gaskins fell silent. The maniac miraculously avoided arrest while carrying a new victim in his car, and he was stopped by a police patrol. Just as law enforcers were about to inspect the monster's car, they were distracted over the radio by a report of a traffic accident, and they rushed to the scene of the accident. After that incident, Gaskins stopped hunting hitchhikers and began a new series of massacres. In November of the 70s, Gaskins took the lives of his niece Janice Kirby, who was 15, and her friend Patricia Ann Ellsberg, who was 17. The Strangler volunteered to give the girls a ride after their birthday party. He took their lives after unsuccessfully attempting to abuse them. The victims resisted vigorously, and the maniac just lost his nerve. Gaskins was on the list of suspects, but when questioned by the police he responded so nonchalantly and confidently that he was released and continued his assaults. For the next 5 years, Donald Gaskins only took out people he knew personally. A friend to whom the surety owed a debt of gratitude, upon learning that Gaskins had a ruined life on his account, attempted to blackmail him. The body of this friend was found in a coastal area of South Carolina. In the year 1971, the maniac's victim was a 20-year-old girl. She was a fellow thief and in doing so allowed herself to mock Donald in public. Gaskins was called in for questioning by the police, but the maniac again survived the ordeal without arousing suspicion of his involvement. The criminal would later confess that it was a great and incomparable pleasure for him to deceive the police. One of Donald Gaskins' most brutal and heinous crimes was the taking of the life of his wife's friend Doreen Dempsey and her young daughter, who was only a year and 8 months old. Doreen trusted Gaskins, and when she was about to move to another city, Gaskins volunteered to help. The woman was glad she could save money on tickets. The executioner drove the woman and her daughter away from Charleston into the woods and began demanding sexual favors from Doreen. She, out of fear for her daughter's life, agreed. But Donald did not get pleasure without abuse, and as a consequence he took her life. The sight of blood turned him on so much that he used her daughter as a sexual partner as well. And later, when questioned in the Supreme Court, seeking to impress the judges, Gaskins proudly stated that he had always loved newborns, but the intercourse with this one was the best in his life. The investigators who handled the case of the death of Doreen Dempsey also summoned Gaskins for questioning, but again he pulled it off and no one was embarrassed that it was around him that strange massacres took place. And soon the criminal began taking orders for attacks. Donald Gaskins was turned over to the police by his accomplice Walter Neely, who had helped him hide the bodies. He was arrested on November 14, 1975 year. Neely pointed out the burial sites to the investigators. Gaskins was charged with 50 massacres. During the interrogations, the maniac confidently answered that he was not guilty of anything. He did not hesitate even to confront Walter Neely, immediately blaming everything on him. On May 28, 1976, Walter Neely, whom the jury found guilty of aiding and abetting but worthy of leniency, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Gaskins to the death penalty. And then the maniac made a deal with justice, confessing to all the atrocities he had committed. According to his confession, there were 116 of them, but the court broke the deal and began a new investigation. Gaskins, in a panic, asked for a new deal and confessed to more massacres. He said he had taken the lives of a total of 150 people. The maniac indicated the burial sites and described all the attacks in detail. Eventually he was charged with 61 lives taken, but the detectives were only able to gather solid evidence on 8. After receiving a life sentence in prison, Gaskins took the life of Rudolph Tyner and told the wardens that he was allegedly paid to do it. Tyner was convicted of shooting an elderly couple in an attempted store robbery. The son of the victims hired Gaskins to settle accounts with Tyner. After several unsuccessful poisoning attempts, Donald constructed an improvised explosive device that looked very much like a portable radio and told Tyner that they could use the device to communicate through the cell wall. When the man in his cell put the device to his ear, it exploded. Tyner was killed. The last thing Rudolph heard before he died was my laughter, Gaskins stated. It was after this massacre of Tyner that Gaskins was sentenced to death. On September 6, 1991, the maniac was executed in the electric chair. The last words the maniac uttered were, "About me will be told all over the world. I am ready to leave, but this is not the end. I will return in another body and I will also take the lives of your wives and daughters."